frightened. And instead of moving forward now and getting totally enlightened, he cannot stop it anyway, he runs backwards and takes the scripture, and he thinks that the fathers read it all literally, which they didn't do. Thomas Aquinas never read the Bible literally, and so on. Neither did Augustine, neither did Origenus, and so on. So, but it is some kind of a refuge. He is frightened, and when we are frightened, we either attack or we run away. So the fundamentalist is running away, and sometimes he gets angry, and then he attacks other people, and so on. So what he should do would be to go through the Enlightenment and then come out on the other side with a new naivete. That means first when he reads the Bible, then he thinks when he becomes critical, he ruins it all for himself. So science and all that ruins his Bible.
At least temporarily.
Well, he thinks forever maybe. But if you take a musical example, for instance, you listen to Beethoven, you can do it in a naive, that's not a bad word now, but in a childlike way, you just follow the melodies and so on, and you say, it's beautiful, beautiful, and so on. But when you study musicology and critical musicology, and you see all the mistakes which Beethoven made, the drums are too loud, the trumpets are too loud, the text goes too fast from one note to the other, and so on, whatever criticism. And you could say, well, now Beethoven is destroyed, I'm disillusioned or whatever, but that's not the case. And when you come out on the other side and you have gone through the critique, you will enjoy Beethoven in a much deeper, beautiful way than you could before. Something similar, analogy, we can also say in religion. If you leave the childlike, there's nothing wrong with it, by the way, except that the world has changed. So if you give that up and you grow up and you go through higher criticism, what all of the historians have found out and so on, then in the end you can come out with a very religious, deeply religious, like Paul Tillich or Niebuhr in this country, very deeply religious attitude, maybe deeper even than the childlike way to look at it. So you have to see that this enlightenment on one side and religion, it came from the religious side. It came Christians, some Christians saw all things read the Bible and understood as it was written there, and they also thought that people at that time understood it as it was written, so that is what they think. And now, if they get out of this naivete, they can still be believers, and that's what they don't believe, the fundamentalists, what they are despairing about, particularly about the values which are rooted, and they think it's all flowing away. We have nothing to hold on to, no hold anymore. What should I tell my grandchildren, and so on. And then he goes back, but going back now, he gets entangled in hypocrisy, because on one side he says this cursed modernity, and then he gets a beautiful heart operation, or he has electricity, or he flies in an airplane, or he has a beautiful car. That's all modernity. So on one side he condemns it, except the Jehovah's Witnesses or so don't do any blood transfusions. That is consequential, but then the courts come, the secular court, and force him to have to rescue his child by getting blood transfusion. So that means he gets entangled, he loses contact with reality, he gets at odds with reality, and so on. So that is a side effect. Okay, so nevertheless, we want to go back to the Pope. The Pope, the formula which he had was who builds walls. Now, we would not be the only ones. I mean, the Israelis have built a wall, a huge wall, high up there, you cannot climb over it. The socialists in the German Democratic Republic built a wall, the so-called Berlin Wall, but they didn't claim to be Christian like Trump. That is the problem. So if the pagans are doing it, that's one thing, but if a Christian is doing it, or somebody who says that he's a Christian, then he is in contradiction with himself. But what makes things difficult is, of course, that a journalist came up tonight and said, I'm a Protestant, so the Pope should not have said that, he should not address anything. So the extreme enlightened people would say that religion should move out of the family and so on, but that would kill religion. So that is why ISIS and these people are so much against the separation of church and state, or Ummah and state, because if you separate, you privatize religion. And then religion becomes just something very narrow in your heart. But if you are in love with somebody, part of this love is that you want to tell people that you are in love. That is how love grows too. So if you have to repress it all the time, it will die. Religion, if you privatize it totally, make it simply a private matter, so that you cannot apply it to anything anymore, then what is it there for? And certainly the critique of the Enlighteners, that religion does not make people more moral, it does not improve their morality. I mean, when you have cases then which excites them is the child abuse of priests or so. So they celebrate the Mass for 20 years and at the same time abuse children and so on. So then comes the idea that this statutory laws in the church, when the church is something like a state or whatever, and the sacramental issue doesn't make any difference in people's moral evolution whatsoever. You have to think that Hitler was a Catholic. He was baptized. His father wanted to become a priest. Hitler himself wanted to become an abbot. When he went out in the landscape there, he visited sometimes Benedictine abbots, we have one down in Three Rivers, and had 4 hours of talks with him and so on. The 4 million men who marched with him into Russia to kill 27 million Russians, they were all baptized Catholics and Protestants. They came from the 28 countries which constitute today the European Union. So this is a catastrophe, this whole thing, right? If you take the Enlighteners' position, only later Enlighteners then gave even up their criticism. They said it's hopeless, the whole thing. And so then they either say, well, let's use religion as much as it's usable, or let's become aggressive and get rid of it. And that's what you had in the Soviet Union. But there you have to be careful too. Even the socialists in the Soviet Union, you know, still did this bourgeois thing and used religion. Because when Hitler marched in, Stalin allowed all the farmers to bring the icons out again, out of the fields where they had buried them. And it was Stalin who set up the Patriarch of Moscow, the successor of whom the Pope just met. So therefore one has to see to what extent there is propaganda, or to what extent you know, real things are there. They did persecute Christians, the Mennonites, because they didn't serve in the armed forces. So they had no conscientious objector status for anybody, like Hitler neither. So, but if you take these things into consideration, and you take that serious, you know, that you live a sacramental life, you go to communion, and you are baptized, and so on, and then people say, secular enlightened people say, now what does your life look like, you know? I mean, look at the second Bush there, you know, he was born again. Born again, you know, is with Nicodemus and the discussion and Jesus about born again. But born again means that you then take the Sermon on the Mount serious, you know, and then you should not kill. The old people said you should not murder. I say if you call somebody you terrorist and you come, you have already murdered him in his heart. And there he's sentenced to death, 152 people under his regime in Texas there and so on, and then responsible for at least 1 million Iraqians and so on. So whatever you may think about this thing, the situation is now so that enlighteners, the secular people, particularly when sometimes they are better than the religious people in their morality, that's possible. And so then they will be very critical, and they will say, look, this guy goes to church and look what he's doing there. He lies the blue from the sky, and he robs other people, and he robs the Vietnamese from robber, takes their rubber, and the El Salvadorians, he takes their coffee, and the Iraqis, he steals their oil and so on. And that is called Christianity. So and that's why it is so painful. This antagonism between the religious and the secular is a very, very painful thing. And when something is painful, then we try to repress it and not to think of it and so on. But it doesn't let us be alone, right? When you turn the television on, there is another culture war thing coming on, right? So you cannot repress it. And when it sleeps a little bit, then it comes up again. So 3 or 4 weeks later. So therefore, we do have to deal with it, but in a civil, in a loving way. And if at the moment, let me give you an example. For instance, let's see stem cell research. So there is this thing now, we want to, when we have stem cell research and we take it from embryos, then it is not yet differentiated, and it can be helpful maybe for Alzheimer's and all kinds of illnesses. So Mrs. Reagan was very much for it, and so, but this is one of these culture wars, and they just take it for an example, how people maybe can deal with it. So both sides want to help Alzheimer patients, right? So they do have something in common. Religious people want to help them, and secular people want to help them, and so on. So now why can't they help them? Well, because when you produce an embryo artificially and inseminate it, and then you use it for 2 weeks and then you kill it. So that is this killing business now, and that's where the religious people protest. There was a time for Catholics, Thomas Aquinas, for instance, who would say that we become human only after 3 months in the womb of the mother. And so one should conclude then the first 3 months maybe you could abort. But strangely enough, these religious people didn't admit to that, because the embryo was already destined to receive the soul, and therefore it was already holy. And then at the same time, at the end of the life, you could not take apart a body because it had been the home of the soul, and so on. So up to the 17th century, the church resisted anatomy and operations and so on, and only then with the scientific revolution it was broken through. So nevertheless, back to our Pope, because he has all this in his background, of course, so there is a whole world with him. It is Catholic solidarism, it is called. So when you know the theory of somebody, Mrs. Clinton, for instance, that is Roosevelt liberalism, right? Then you know where she comes from, you understand what she says, and you know what she will do, and you also know what she will not do. She will not nationalize the banks. It's not in Roosevelt's liberalism. And when you have Bernie with his democratic socialism from Denmark and so on, you know also what he will do and what he will not do. He will not hang the 1% of billionaires. He will not even force them to forced labor, like the Chinese did. The Chinese sentenced the whole capitalistic ruling class to hard labor. There's nothing more terrible for a capitalist than to work. And when he has to work suddenly, he rather commits suicide. So that's what they did. So it was not the state which killed them. They killed themselves because it's such a horrible thing. Not for the others, but for me, it's bad. The others, okay, the others have to work. Otherwise, I'm not a billionaire. Okay, so the Pope's thing. Let's say what is behind that is this what is called solidarism. So very often we know there are fascists, there are socialists, and there are communists and so on, but we don't know that the Pope also has a worldview, if you want to put it that way. And this worldview has been worked out since 1891. And he argues all day long, he argues in those terms. So in 1891, the Roman Catholic Church suddenly discovered that something was wrong with capitalism. That was 50 years after Marx. So religious people are slow learners. But that's not a bad thing. Sometimes when you learn slowly, you don't make so many mistakes. So nevertheless, 50 years later, finally they got the idea that something was wrong. And so they wrote these encyclical letters. The first one was Rerum Novarum, new things. They think capitalism was a new thing. It was around for 300 years already. So nevertheless, Rerum Novarum, and then the other one was Quadragesimo Anno, 40 years. So 40 years later, they wrote another one. And so these popes go on. This one hasn't written one yet, but the others before him, everybody writes a social encyclical letter, and they always quote the other popes. They seldom, or if never, quote anybody else. That is very bad somehow. They should quote somebody else. And somebody they did. They did the Ratzinger, the Benedict XVI, he quoted then Horkheimer and Adorno, who are the two leaders of the Frankfurt School, who are responsible for liberation theology and the new theology and political theology in Europe and so on. So sometimes they do, but it happens very seldom. So by the way, Quadragesimo Anno, when our system broke down here, capitalism was laying flat, and your grandfathers or grandfathers or whatever were sitting on the street and had no work and no food and whatever. So at that point, Roosevelt, the second Roosevelt, the first one was already very social-minded, but the second one even more so, he suddenly said during a speech, New Deal. He had no clue what that was. It just slowly dawned to him what that would be. So he invited social workers and tycoons, and he put them together in one room, and he said, you have to come up with something which makes sense. The alternative was that he would have done the same thing what Hitler did and what Mussolini did in Franco and so on, to ask for the emergency laws. If he had done that, he would have become a dictator like Hitler. Hitler was a dictator legally. The Center Catholic Party gave him the right. So, but here another way was found, and that was amazing. So the New Deal, instead of calling for the emergency laws, and then came Social Security and some of these things. And before Roosevelt died, he did some human rights declaration again, which was never realized here. But Bernie could take that up, or Mrs. Clinton as well. So, nevertheless, the point is, when we want to understand Mrs. Clinton or understand Trump or so, then we have to see that they have a certain worldview. It may be more or less clear to them. They may not be real philosophers. Sometimes they are called ideologues. That is not a good thing. An ideologue, in a critical sense, is somebody who has a false consciousness. It is somebody who somehow who covers up national and class interests. Shortly, it's the untruth. So I think we owe it to people that we take them seriously in their worldview and say, Mr. Reagan has this philosophy, has a neoliberal philosophy. He first had a Roosevelt liberal philosophy, and then he changed over, he converted. One can go from one worldview to the other. He was a labor union leader first, and then he went over and to the neoliberalism, and went from Keynes over to the Chicago School and began to deregulate, and that brought the catastrophe of 2008. So it is important, now more important than to say what is the gender of this person, is he a man or a woman or African American or whatever. It is much more important to say what is his worldview, and has he lived in it, and how long has he lived in it, has he practiced it, did it succeed or whatever. Now when you have a catastrophe like 2008, then you can say that Mr. Reagan had an ideology. So that means a philosophy which becomes a catastrophe, that is an ideology then. But one should not start out with it. So sometimes in 1827 was the first Great Depression, and liberalism didn't work at all, because liberalism is atomistic, so everybody helps himself. But when you cannot help yourself because the whole economy is down, last week again it crashed there, so then of course you need somebody else. And that Roosevelt took from Quadragesimo Anno. It was taken from the Social and Circular Letter of the popes, the principle of subsidiarity. And that means you should, like the liberals say, you should, do your own thing, you are responsible for yourself and so on, but sometimes you can't help yourself. So then the family, if the family cannot, the city, then the state, and then the federation, and if there's a big catastrophe, then you may have to ask the UN or whatever. So that is the principle of subsidiarity, which was taken out of this encyclical, and it is still in the other encyclicals which come later on. So Catholicism had this great advantage that it developed an ethics, a social ethics, by which people can deal with this. It is between liberalism and socialism on the other side. So that means the Pope could come closer to Bernie, for instance, but he could also come closer to Trump. But his experience with fascism in Argentina, and then, of course, we have with Romero with fascism in El Salvador, which is coming up again now. So the Pope is very sensitive for fascist tendencies, that means racist tendencies and nationalistic tendencies, so that this time he wants to be punctual. And that has something to do with the attack, which, if you want to call it an attack, on Trump. So,
Rudy?
Yes.
Do you want to clarify what you mean by liberalism to them?
Yeah. Liberalism is a Christian thing originally. So it comes from Calvinism, and it is a social theory, right? A social theory which does not emphasize the collective. So therefore, keep the government small. They want to have a big army, but a small government. It doesn't fit, it never did. So therefore, it is a theory which emphasizes the individual rather than the community. Or it emphasizes personal autonomy, that we give ourselves our laws, but it does not emphasize solidarity. Not solidarity with the past, the victims of the past, the slaves, the serfs, the wage laborers, not with the victims of the present on the other side of the railroad station here, or the victims of the children who come to whom we give our enormous national debt or whatever. That is solidarity. So the Slavic world, I told you last time that I traveled back and forth between the two worlds, and that also the church took first the Pope from the Slavic world, and now they took one from the American world. So for once the church is on time, it's punctual. It's a little bit late because he was supposed to take the place of the German Pope, and it was a little trick why the German got it first, but he was already a candidate and was supposed to be the Pope several years ago, but didn't make it because of some constellations which we may or may not go into it. Okay, so there was another issue which came up, and that is our judge, Scalia, died. And that is connected because Scalia was a Catholic. And he probably shared not only probably, he shared the values of the Pope. That means he shared this solidarism, which can go open to the left or open to the right. As a matter of fact, historically, it has always opened up to the right. What makes this Pope unusual is that he may open it up to the left. But Wall Street has already put the first shots against him, and he cannot go too far with it. But his predecessor, John Paul II, opened it up to the right. So he got money from here, and he gave it to the Solidarity Union in Poland, and was their co-responsible for the neoliberal counter-revolution of 1989. Okay, so let's say something about Scalia. So in a certain sense, with his heart, he was on the religious side. He went to Mass all the time. I think somebody even called in a priest. He was in a hunting lodge or whatever, and in the middle of the night at 4 o'clock in the morning, somebody still called a priest for the last rites. And so he was never divorced, and he had 9 children. So that makes him Catholic. So nevertheless, but at the same time, he was an originalist or textualist. That is the same thing what in religion is a fundamentalist. That means he read the Constitution as it was written. He thought he knew how it was written, and he thought that he knew how the people who lived at that time, how they read it. So that is called textualism or originalism and so on. But then he did an unbelievably tricky thing. Bourgeois characters are always very cunning and tricky. So he used the Constitution. That means he did the exact opposite what the Enlighteners did. We said before, the Enlighteners instrumentalized religion for their purposes. He did the exact opposite. He used the Enlightenment Constitution in order to reinforce traditional values. So he made one attack after the other. One is this thing with the contraception. What is this business there, this Protestant business?
Hobby Lobby?
Yeah, we have it on the mall. I always think it's a funny name, but nevertheless. So there was this issue, and he decided that for religious freedom, that means they did not have to pay for contraception for their workers. And the same thing, of course, with Porches Hospital here. They don't want to pay for contraception either. If you go there, they don't give you any contraception. If you want to have an abortion, you have to take a taxi and go to the Methodist place, and they do it. There you see that the religion themselves, that means the same religion is split up, and one is closer to modernity, and the other one is a little bit further away. As a matter of fact, all the old Catholic countries are all a little bit backward in terms of capitalism. The Protestants are much more, like England or whatever, they are much more at the foreground. So it still determines to some extent our world situation at this moment. So so there were other things through the years, and every opportunity which was there in order to fight for these traditional values he used. And of course he lost them all. What could he have expected? But nevertheless he was humorous. He had a sense of humor, so he didn't take it personally when he lost it, and he lost it a lot. So and that made him a man whom people liked, and he was likable, and what they were shouting he did, they knew why he was shouting, and so on. But bring the class thing in, for a moment. There is a guy who has 9 children, so, I mean, he could afford 9 children. He did not belong to the billionaires, but he belonged to the middle bourgeoisie, and they are very well off. So in the middle bourgeoisie, you can afford 9 children without birth control. So, but the others may have a hard time who live on the north side or even on the other side of Ohio State, on both sides. And so that members of the bourgeoisie dictate the values which are binding for 250 million workers in this country. That is, of course, a very strange situation. We are the only country which has no labor party. And why we are so backward socially, in terms of minimum wage, and we have no living wage, and we have no toilet paper. On Sunday we will collect toilet paper here again, because they have no toilet paper. The toilet paper industry cannot even get enough toilet paper for the slums or wherever. So that means the fundamental thing in the society is the need system. Civil society is need system, administration of justice, and police, and so on. So we have to measure. When my children come and say, this is $1 billion industry, I said, what are they producing? What needs are they fulfilling? And then they say to me, if we would have asked this question, we would not have gone into business in the first place. I said, what the hell are you going into business for? The business has nothing other business than to fulfill the needs of society. And if after 200 years they still cannot deal with the health insurance, then, of course, we have to get the state in. The best way how a businessman can keep the state out, if they want to keep state out, is to fulfill those needs. It is so horribly simple, the whole thing. But they haven't done it, and they cannot do it, and they still cannot do it. So then, of course, the state has to come in, no matter what they say. So, okay, so
there's a question.
Yeah.
While you're on
I'm sorry. Yes.
contraception,
Oh, I forgot.
on the Pope's way back from
Yeah.
Mexico,
Right.
he made a statement.
That's what we talked about.
Did
yeah.
you talk
Yeah.
about it all?
Well, he's making
No,
statements.
the Zika.
Maybe it's another one.
The Zika virus.
Oh, that's new, yeah.
That's
new,
today.
yeah.
Pope
Yeah, okay.
Francis has suggested that women threatened with the Zika virus could use artificial contraception, but not abort their fetus, saying there's a clear moral difference between aborting a fetus and preventing pregnancy. That's a big statement, yeah.
Yeah, right. Right. I
There's a
mean,
precedent
that is
for
what the secular side would always say, if one uses contraception, then one can prevent abortions. So, but so far the church had never agreed to it. So we have to see what he.
Rudy,
thinks
there was
about it.
there was a precedent for it.
Yeah, in the Congo.
From the Congo from the 1960s, where nuns were being raped
Yeah.
during a time of war, and I think it was it Pope Pius XII, maybe?
Yes.
Pope Pius XII, that allowed them to take artificial
Yeah.
birth control as to not get pregnant through rape.
Yeah. Okay, let me say that the church has a law, right? It's a canon law and so on. And there is a principle which is called epikeia. That means when there is a certain situation, you look through the eyes of the lawgiver, and you ask what in this specific situation the lawmaker intended. And so under this thing, it is possible to suspend certain things and would say the lawgiver would never wanted such a horrible or tragic situation to happen and so on. So, but it does not mean that the law in its universality is changed. It means only that the priest or whatever it is at that time, that he can use epikeia, E-P-K-E-I-A, can use this epikeia and can say, in this situation, the lawmaker, that would be God who is the lawmaker, he would never have intended this horrible thing. and then by conscience, you know, and see with the contraception thing, when that happened in the 60s, the capitalistic class in the 60s paid $10 million in order to put the working class on the pill. And it worked. They got zero population. That means everybody reproduces himself once, and that means 2 children per family. And when you look back to your grandfathers, grandfathers, so there are 9, and there are 5, and there are 3, and there are 2, and so on. So in my family, I have 14 grandchildren, and I have 7 living children, and it works exactly how it ought to work, in spite of the fact that one did not get married, and another one has only 1 child, but the other one has 3, and the other one has 3, and so it comes out exactly how the capitalists wanted to come out, because that stabilizes the market, and they have enough troops for the colonies, and so on. So that works.
So it doesn't have anything to do with the education of women?
Yeah, right. That's a woman thing. Yeah, no.
No, I'm just asking. I like that too.
No,
It makes a lot more
but
sense.
this is another problem. But we just wanted to answer this one thing there with the epikeia thing there. So that is why these exceptions are possible. So, but if one would think that the Pope now has converted and that he is no longer a solidarist or whatever, that would not be right. So, and there are these slippery slope things, we mentioned them a few hours before there, where the journalists don't know what to do with him. Because he said, you know, if a homosexual takes care of his partner and they are good people and so on, who am I to judge? Well, he is judging all day long, by the way. By the way, Jesus did that too. He said, don't judge anybody, and then next sentence he does judge somebody. So that, but this is just minor issues. So nevertheless, this is, would explain the exceptions, right? But that we are not open ourselves up for disappointments later on, because I'm a little bit afraid, you know, that people say, now this Pope, he will become really enlightened, you know, and he will become a real modern person and so on. There is no hope that he will become that. So he is a Jesuit on top of all of this, you know. And by the way, there is this book here where he is described in a very positive way, some kind of, it's not a biography, it's an interview which a Jesuit has made, so that you know about his Jesuit background. Let me just see the, you know, how complicated that is. There is the other book here, which I also mentioned to you, but which is done by a great man, by Matthew Fox, and maybe you have heard of him. He was in Chicago, was a Dominican, and he is now an Episcopalian. He was thrown out. He was thrown out by Benedict out of the order and so on. Now, he is a specialist in the great mystic Master Eckhart. I don't know if you have heard of him. Beautiful fellow. If he would have come through, you know, and his friends and his successors, then the Reformation would have taken another way somehow, and things would be a little bit different. But this mystic, the great mystic Master Eckhart, he was sentenced by the Inquisition, and then he defended himself, and he won. The Inquisition said, yeah, you're right, but then he died. And afterwards, he started the Inquisition again, and he lost because he was dead. He couldn't defend himself anymore. And that was 700 years ago, and he is still excommunicated. So if we want to have a real test whether he's a reformer, the present Pope is a reformer, not to speak of a revolutionary and so on, then it's the question, first of all, what he will do with this Matthew Fox there. If he will say, Fox, we're very sad, you know, that this happened, and we will, you know, take the ban off you. That means they excommunicated him too. And so there are 90 like him, 90 great theologians who have all been fired. So we are not aware. So if you, on one side, you have this very positive book, and then on the other side, you have what happened before him, and why people put such great hope on him, that he would do and make all these things good, right? But now one should think it wouldn't be so difficult, because Ignatius of Loyola, who is the founder of the Pope's order, was influenced by Master Eckhart. He was a mystic as well. And so one should think, you know, and he has some mystical elements as well, that he then could become enlightened and say, well, we have to do something about Master Eckhart. Maybe the Inquisition was wrong. Maybe the Inquisition sentenced him pantheism. That is, you know, what you have in Judaism so we had it too. So, and pantheism was a bad thing. It was just another name for atheism. But what Meister Eckhart was, he was a panentheist. God is all in all, and so on, which was different. So they misunderstood him. And so he could easily say now, you know, the Inquisition was wrong, the monks didn't see the light, and so therefore we take the ban off. You and this fox and all the people in between whom we have sentenced, you know. So that would be a real criterion of a real progress. Epikeia would not be enough.
Oh.
As such, you know, it's consoling, you know, that this is done, but it would not make us really, it would not solve the problem.
Sounds like epikeia is more like the exception that proves the rule.
Yeah, but I mean, the main thing is, you know, that one said, you know, the law is always abstract. The real people are very singular in their being and so on. Never can this universal and this particular person can that come together. That's why we have the judge, right? The judge applies the laws, the abstract and universal laws, to that accused person. But we have a wonderful arrangement here, and that is the jury trial. That means we have people who outbalance the judge. And so the judge has this understanding of the law, he studied that, but this is a concrete person in concrete context and a situation and so on. And therefore, the jury should be of our peers, of our class and so on, who look through our eyes and they understand why we did this and what the context was and so on. So we try to balance this. So Karl Rahner mentioned a lot of this. So therefore, it can always happen that the law says this, but then there's a very concrete situation in which this person finds himself or herself. And that is where one can say that was never the intent of the divine or the earthly lawmaker to produce this harm and this pain and this suffering for this person, and then they can make a decision. So, or the lesser evil, they bring something. So, the greater evil is this, and birth control is the lesser evil. It does not even say that it is a good thing, the birth control. You may very well say that it is just the lesser evil in comparison to an abortion.
That's precisely what he said on the planet.
Yeah, okay, that's what he said. There we have it, yeah, right. So, so therefore, we should not, I mean, I'm all for it, you know, to have great expectations, but then if you have them which are not real in terms of where he comes from, being Jesuit and being a man of this solidarism and so on, there was a time when he was considered to be an extreme traditionalist in Argentine when he was the head of the Jesuit order there and so on. So, he changed. He has repented this. He was an authoritarian personality, and it's very hard to overcome that. There is a great psychologist, Erich Fromm, who has written a lot about the authoritarian personality. So on one side you have the revolutionary personality, on the other one the authoritarian. It's the fascist personality. So in between. So Erich Fromm made a study in Germany before Hitler with about 8,000 workers, and in order to find out what chance fascism has, like we have it here now, what chance fascism has to break through. And the more authoritarian personalities you have, the more likely it is that fascism will break through. So the authoritarian personality is backward-oriented, the good old times. My aunt in Rochester said, 1900 there were no labor unions yet, it was paradise here, and so on. So that is backward. And then it is nationalistic, by country right or wrong. It is capitalistic. People need leaders. They are lazy. They would just sleep at Lake Michigan, would go fishing. If there was not a fort to put them all in the assembly line with thugs to beat them up if they don't work fast enough, so and so on. This is this leadership idea. Then it has a masochistic and a sadistic, there is sadism toward the weaker class or race or what, downward. And then there is masochism. There is, you know, they are also willing to suffer a lot. So it comes originally from sexuality, that people enjoy sex when they suffer or when they can produce suffer. but it has been separated from the sexual thing, and then becomes a characteristic of the personality. And then the authoritarian personality is racist. I had a friend here, professor, and one day I was sitting with him and I described the fascist personality, and he stood up and shouted, "You cannot tell me in my own house that I'm a fascist." I said, "I didn't tell you that you were a fascist. I just described what a fascist is," and it became so obviously clear to him suddenly. He came from Croatian fascism, which I'm so familiar with. So, nevertheless, this, and on the other side you have the revolutionary person. When Erich Fromm came over here, we are so right-wing here, that's very out of sight even. So then he called the revolutionary personality the democratic one. It sounded better, democratic personality. So the Pope was this authoritarian personality, and he did much harm for his Jesuits who were under him. And so many left the Jesuit order under him because they wanted to be like Romero, or like with the liberation theologians under Romero. Not Romero himself, really, but they wanted to fight the fascist government, fight for the workers, fight for the poor, and so on. And he was against all of this. So there are two people who have charged him with having betrayed them against the fascist government. And one of them, he celebrated Mass in St. Georgen in Frankfurt, where he studied for a little while, just 2 years ago or whatever, and so they reconciled then. But the other one, I don't think there was any reconciliation and so on. So we have to see this too, and so on. So if he says he has learned and so on, but as you know, this is a behaviorist university here, so you can change your behavior without changing your character. So during the dating process, you can be very nice and friendly, but then the sadism suddenly comes out later on anyway. So therefore, the conditioning of behavior is one thing. The transformation of the character, if he ever has become a democratic personality, that is, of course, questionable. But that is psychology, and we don't have to go into this. So, okay, do we have any other question about Judge Scalia? We went to him too. So you have people like this in this country, and maybe in the future it could be that somebody, appears very much like Obama too. Obama converted to Christianity in Chicago. Was that genuine? In Scandinavia, in Norway, they wanted to take the Nobel Peace Prize away from him recently, and but they changed their mind and said with deep regret they let him have it and so on. So, but so is the conversion? Did it really happen? Sometimes Obama looks like somebody who is a very secular person, but has some religious motivation in him, and that may very well be the future, how these two things can come together. That you have secular people, some of them are motivated by humanism, but others may be motivated by Christianity or by Buddhism and so on. So, because not only Scalia lost all rearguard struggles, but since 400 years, the religious community has lost all struggles. And what that does in terms of credibility of the religious communities, sometimes they can keep their credibility only because people have forgotten what has happened. They can't remember anymore, right? So, but one has to calculate it in order to be honest and so on, right? We have to be honest about these things. Maybe some of them would have been lost, background reading, if religious people or secular people had been more wise or whatever. But it is serious when you lose against Copernicus and Galileo and Newton and the evolutionists and Marx and Freud and so on. It's all lost. And so the mainstream churches then, said after decades and decades, said, well, we are right, the guy was right anyway. So, but there are still churches, hold on to. That is when we had our monkey trial here in the 20s or so, and there's still monkeys around there who still have the same ideas. Yes.
You've been mentioning things that have happened this week in the news. Do you want to comment on the letters that were talked about on television that were written by Pope John Paul?
Right. Okay, yeah. So that has something to do, with something which also reformers would like to change. That is the forced celibacy thing. So we about 3 years ago, when Benedict was still there, we gave them in Germany. I say we, a circle of my friends, we gave them 120 points of reform, and that was one of them. And that story has something to do with it. Benedict himself has a very close woman friend with whom he plays for years and years already piano and so on and so on. So John Paul II also had a Polish philosopher, I think at Harvard, with whom we exchanged. We only have his letters now. We don't have her letters and so on. But it seemed it was a very intimate friendship between them. And before he died, he wanted her to come, and that means that it was a very close friendship and so on. So, but that people become suspicious about that has something to do with this celibacy thing there. I just got a letter from Germany just the last week, and there was a woman from my parish, and she had found a book which I had written about the pastor of my parish, and his name was Rudolf J, and so he raised me. He was something like a father to me. My father died very early from cancer, and so he took that father on, and I admired him greatly, and I saw him fighting against fascism, and he was beaten up by the Gestapo in the basement in Frankfurt, and so on and so on. And there were always Gestapo people sitting when he gave his sermons, and his sermons were very prophetic and so on. So I was a great admirer. Maybe I admired him a little bit too much and so on, but nevertheless, I wrote this book. And so this woman wrote that she was also with Rudolf J, and I knew her family even, and she went to communion and to confirmation, and she was very enthusiastic about the pastor. But then something happened. Suddenly he disappeared. That means one Sunday the people came and he wasn't there. And so he was taken out of his office and put in the mountains somewhere. And then there were rumors going around. And so another book was written about him, and so I told her, I said, well, a lot of rumors had to do with fascism. People said he was a fascist. He put the Nazi flag up and so on. I said, no, these rumors are wrong, because the IG Farben was the big chemical industry which produced Cyclone B, with which the Jews were gassed in Auschwitz and so on. So, and these workers, they were all Nazis, and they didn't want the pastor. They wanted to throw him out of the parish. If he had been a Nazi, they would not have wanted to throw him out and so on. So that I wrote to him. And then she wrote back, and it was really shaken. She didn't even address me by my name anymore. But she said, it was about celibacy. And then I wrote back, I said, yes, some of the rumors were celibacy. But I said, forced celibacy is a curse. And I wrote behind it Hans Küng. Hans Küng is a great German theologian whom I brought here, by the way, the Miller Auditorium and so on. And we were sitting at the Rhine River and drinking wine last day, and then a messenger came and said that a young priest had committed suicide because he could not reconcile his promise not to get married. The secular priests, both popes, they are secular priests. Not this one, he's an order man. But Benedict XVI and John Paul, they were secular priests. They do not take a vow. They don't take a vow of chastity. They take a promise not to get married, which is different. But a Benedictine, a Dominican, a Franciscan monk or so, he takes a vow, and there are a great difference between the two. So, nevertheless, I had a similar experience before in a parish where on Christmas Eve we were ready for the Mass, and suddenly we found the priest hanging there up in the tower and hanged himself and so on. So these types of conflict, and if it's only one, it's one too many and so on. So, and the Orthodox Church, and we mentioned that already, has it different. It has a married and an unmarried clergy. The bishops are unmarried and the patriarchs, but the priests are married and so on. That is a much better solution and so on. So that was one of the reform things now. And but we can ask, can he change something in order to take that stupid suspicion, as if celibacy becomes for some Catholics the most important thing. So somebody can for 40 years he can do the most heroic thing and becomes martyrized and so on. And then suddenly something comes. I think the priest, did have a relationship, and he did have an illegitimate son. I think the son even visited me and visited the other author as well. So it happened. So very probably it's not only rumor. So this is, and if it happens only in one life, it would be too much and so on. So it has produced a lot of horrible things. So I don't say that if celibacy would be reformed, that then we would not have child abuse cases or whatever. We would have them because married people do the same thing and so on. And
We have that same problem in our
yeah,
denomination.
right. So it could not be settled, but it has to be settled. It was introduced by a monk in the year 1000. Together with the sacrament of marriage, also celibacy was introduced. So, and it would be much better to have, like the Protestant paradigm and the Orthodox paradigm, that one leaves it free. It is, if somebody, freely decides that there's nothing wrong with it, it is the forced character. You are punished, you are punished by these rumors, and then you are thrown out, and there are even church penalties, you are defrocked or whatever, And and they have become more neurotic because with opening up with the council, then 10,000 priests left and nuns left, and so Paul VI, became frightened, and they never stopped to be frightened, and then they become even narrower and so on. So that is one of the reform points, and this will, what this Pope will succeed and who he will be in the end. That will be one point, what he will do about it, and that is important because we do not ask anybody, no Buddhist, no Muslim or whatever, to give up what is part of his constant faith substance. No secular man or religious man can do this. So therefore, in Christianity, we have Christ as the center of, and so on and so on. And we don't want the Pope, to give anything up to what belongs to revelation. But the forced celibacy, first of all, it comes first 3 chapters of the Genesis, which is valid. God created man as man and woman, and he wanted them to be one and multiply and so on and so on. So there it is, The criterion of what the church does, if the church does something right or wrong, is the revelation, and the Jewish revelation is included. Otherwise, you are Manichaean, because the Mahdi in Persepolis in 250 or so, he separated the Old and the New Testament. And Yahweh was the evil God, and Jesus' Father was the good God, like it is in Persia, in Zoroastrianism and so on. That sneaked into the church, And they repressed it all the time, but it came up with St. Augustine, for instance, who, the whole city is St. Augustine. St. Augustine lived in concubinage, for 9 years or whatever, had a son, illegitimate son, who he called Adeodatus. That means given by God. It was illegitimate and given by God at the same time. So, unfortunately, he let the poor woman go then, who loved him dearly, and back to Africa. By the way, he was an African. He's black. He was black. But in St. Augustine, he's white. So I tell my students always to take a ladder and go up and paint this guy black. The same thing is true with his mother, who has also a church here. She's also black. Only, yes, in Monica. And Ambrose, he's white. Ambrose was an Aryan. He taught St. Augustine. So he taught Augustine. So nevertheless, so this, Paul, of course, Paul says very clearly that celibacy was not taught by Jesus. So it's not from him, he says. It's, I counsel you because it works well with him. Now, according to Jesus, there are 3 types of eunuchs, and you never know what kind of a eunuch you have. Because one type of eunuchs, they are eunuchs by nature. It means biologically something doesn't function. And then there are eunuchs by society. So the harems guys were castrated, and so were the boys in the church up to the 17th century to keep their voices high. So, and then there are eunuchs for the kingdom's sake, because in the kingdom people don't get married anymore because they don't die anymore. So therefore, that was the thing which Jesus thought, not for priests. He didn't think of any priesthood or whatever, when I said to the priest down there was a meeting, I said, Jesus was not a priest. He was not a king neither. He was an anti-priest. He criticized them from the morning to the night, so that's why they hanged him in the end. So, nevertheless, it was for divorced people. Jesus taught, whoever divorces a woman makes her an adulteress, and whoever marries a divorced person lives in adultery. Therefore, don't get married. So it's not the separation, but it is the remarriage. So instead of remarrying, become a eunuch for the kingdom's sake. Now, it takes force to take this thing and apply it to a priesthood, which was recreated out of the Jewish example much later. So, nevertheless, that's where it comes from. So it is somehow the monks took over the church and imposed this promise, and then Manichaeist elements are connected with it, and that makes it dangerous. When I studied in the city of Mainz, there were two Protestant ministers who wanted to convert to Catholicism and become priests. So the church said they could keep their marriage. So that means celibacy was cancelled for them. And so one was 70 years old, that wasn't such a problem anymore, but the other one was 40, and when he went from the seminary to the cathedral, Catholics came and said, please don't do that. Don't mix up the dirty marriage with the holy priesthood. And when that was told to the bishop, Storr was his name, he wept, because the church officially had repressed this Manichaeism. You know, if you have an old aunt who says, you know, work is dirty, the priest monkeys and whatever, and they're dirty things or whatever, that is Manichaeism. The prostitutes in Rome, you know, they go through the night and do their work, and then they go to Mass in the morning, because they separate the soul, the purity of the soul, and the dirtiness of the body or whatever. St. Augustine did that too. He was an orator, he was a philosophy professor, and he was idealistic, a Platonist, and so on, all in heaven, and then there was some concubinage on the other side. So that is this split, is Manichaeism, and it has been rejected by the church, but it is there, and it comes out in Catholicism when people suddenly, because a priest now gets laid out or gets married or whatever, then he's nothing for them. No matter what he did, he's just excommunicated, defrocked or whatever. So that's not unhealthy. So, and Augustine, was a great thinker, and he had influence for centuries up to the day Luther was influenced. Luther was an Augustinian Aramite. Luther belonged to Augustine's order. So, Paul and St. Augustine, have somewhat messed up the Christian sexual morality, and so that is something where he could work on, to simply to say that he was also in love once is not enough. We still don't know what kind of a eunuch he is. So, but this is it's not. And what I wanted to say is, you see, he is not bound by revelation to hold on to it, because the church made the law, and the church can undo the law which the church made. But if a law is, according to their perspective, given by God, then the church has no right to change it. But this they can change. And the same thing is for women priests and so on. There is nothing in the New Testament which would forbid the Pope to discuss. Benedict said we cannot even discuss it anymore. And John Paul also said, first of all, the Pope has no right to forbid anybody to discuss anything. It's not in the canon law. There is no canon which allows him to do that. So people should continue to do that. But then, is there something in the New Testament, or is there something even in the tradition? No, it's just they didn't do it, But that they didn't do it, sometimes they may be able to do something new for once. So therefore that should be discussed, and this is another test stone where we can say, is he really a reformer now, or is he not a reformer? Yes.
Aren't there too many bishops who were appointed by Benedict,
Right.
who are so conservative, that even if the Pope brings it up,
right,
he's got a stone wall against him?
He will, yes.
And he's not going to live, I hate to say that, but unless there's a miracle.
Yeah.
I don't think he can live long enough at his age to appoint enough bishops
That's right, yeah.
to make that change?
Okay, so that was our last discussion about restoration. So there was a whole period of restoration. The council opened up the window to talk to the Protestant brothers and sisters and so on, and to the secular people and so on. And then came that wind, like today, and flew through the whole church, and they became frightened, and Paul VI even forbid the seminarians to go to the movies, and he kept the keys, and so there's a neurosis, you know, they need the couch, they had to be put on the couch, but it got worse and worse, and the Benedict, you know, it reached the climax, and you see that in that book here by Fox, and it became horribly bitter, and I think the normal Catholic has no idea what harm was done. You know, Boff, for instance, liberation theologian, he had to come before the Inquisition, and the Inquisition is medieval. He could not bring lawyers for his defense. Boff, B-O-F-F. And he brought 3 cardinals along, but they didn't let the cardinals come in. Ratzinger didn't let the cardinals come in so that they could say something in his defense and so on. So Hans Küng, whom I mentioned before, doesn't even go there. He said, you know, this is a medieval type of institution, and I do not subordinate myself under that and so on. So, yes, you are right. I mean, he is time-wise, he is limited, energy-wise, he is limited, and so on. And these, you know, Benedict and John Paul II and Paul already, they began. I mean, Paul still had an encyclical, you know, Rerum Populorum, something in which he even recommended revolution, you know. So he was very progressive, but they became frightened. The Pill encyclical shows that whole fear. What will people say when we suddenly, after 2,000 years, you know, are opening up to contraception and so on? And then they did something which was good, but which came too late, because it was the Thomas Aquinas, the great teacher of the Catholics, who suddenly got that discovery where he said that the conscience is the last instance. So if you see something in the Catholic Church, and the Catholic Church teaches something wrong according to your opinion, you have to follow your conscience, and on Judgment Day you will not be judged if you were conformed to that teaching, but you will be judged according to having followed your conscience. So that would have solved the whole problem, leave it to the conscience, to the people. But they had repressed it so long, so now they couldn't bring it up fast enough. And so people then, after the pill came out, and women had gone on the pill already, and didn't want to stop it anymore, then they didn't go to confession anymore. Why the hell should you confess all the time what you do next week anyway? So therefore the confession became emptier and emptier and so on. Just some little old creature came there and then went there and confessed something. So and it is still in a crisis, you know, the confessional. You know, the Protestants cut out the 5 sacraments because they were not grounded enough in the New Testament. But they kept 2, the Eucharist and the baptism. When you go up there, you can see that they are in the church here. There are Catholics who have learned from Luther, but it took them 400 years. When you come in, you have the baptismal, and then you have the altar with the Eucharist, and all the other sacraments have disappeared. Yeah. Not really. They have them all, but they don't show them anymore. The same thing what the Anglicans have, who have 2 major sacraments, and then they have 5 minor sacraments, so that you can still have the priesthood in the
yeah. So and the reverse of that has been true. Like the Catholics have learned from Luther, and now the Protestants are learning how to reconnect with our tradition as well. We're reforming the Reformation.
Yeah.
So
and the reason for that is the paradigm change in the church is something like a revolutionary thing. So the next paradigm. So I said before, you know, that the faith substance remains the same in all 5 or 6 paradigms, but then in these paradigms there can be radical changes. So the Orthodox paradigm negated the Jewish-Christian one, the Roman Catholic negated the Orthodox one, and then the Protestant negated the Roman Catholic one. So there is a process of negation, but it is not an abstract negation. it is also preservation of what has been negated. So therefore, the Gospels, which belong to the first paradigm, remain preserved throughout all the so that you can say, you know, Tom, is he a Christian or not? You know, that can be very well decided. In the thing that means, is he in conformity with the Gospels? Is he in conformity with the Sermon on the Mount? Does he do it or not, or whatever? So,
Excuse me, Dad, we keep mixing politics and church.
mhm.
And what this country is based on, what our Constitution is based on, is a separation
Yeah.
of those.
Yeah, that's what.
So if we look at the church, what really scares me is I hear the Pope welcoming everyone in the front door. I see the vast majority of our pastors welcoming us in the front door. And unfortunately, I see our bishops sweeping us out the back door. There's my problem.
Yeah, the problem is that these bishops now, they are restoration bishops.
Yeah.
What do they want to restore? That's important. See, language is always time-bound, historically bound. If we say Luther was a restoration man, it would be wrong. Simply by saying, well, he restored the New Testament or whatever. But fundamentally he was a reformer, and he was even a revolutionary. So the question is also, when we talk and say these popes are, and we expect that he will change that, are restoration people, then we have to ask, what do they want to restore? They want to restore what was there before Vatican II. They want to restore Vatican I, and they want to restore Trent, the Council of Trent, which responded to Luther's revolution. So that is something very specific. That means these bishops think that something went wrong in the Second Vatican Council, that progressive theologians like Karl Rahner and so on pressed forward, and that the church was not with them, that the people were not prepared for the liturgical reform, that suddenly the altar was taken away from the wall and became a table, and therefore the meal character was balanced against the sacrificial character. We had a heresy charge here against Father John, where somebody said Father John takes the Mass as a meal. That is heresy, and so on. Father John didn't know the difference, had not read a book for 30 years. So, nevertheless, he celebrated just what his heart said, and he had a wonderful heart for all the people. So he celebrated the meal, and of course it was a sacrifice. It didn't make any difference, and so on. So, but all that, people were not prepared for it. That's what the bishops would say. And therefore it produced just chaos in the church, and we have to establish law and order in the church again, and so on. And there were wild things happening, in the 60s and 70s and so on. It is when you have repressed things for 400 years and you open up the windows, what do you expect? Right? So that is what splits the whole thing now. And what can he do about this now? He wants to be pastoral again, like John the 23rd. That's a good thing. So he can use epikeia many times for homosexuals, abortion, whatever. He makes it easier now. What is it? The abortion case. You don't have to go to the bishop anymore. You can just go to your pastor. And so simple things. And I mean, that is the fundamental rule. We don't want him to change something which the church considers is not in its own power. But there are a lot of things which are not based in the New Testament, and some are outright against it. Jesus says, "Don't call anybody father. You have only one Father in heaven." And there are all these little fathers running around who live in celibacy. They're not even fathers. I, with my 7, 8 children, I say to Ken, "Father." This is a ridiculous thing, it's by all standards and so on. So that could be changed. And why don't they change it? They don't change it because they say, well, we got used to it. So a journalist asked John Paul II, you cannot really call yourself father. It's in the New Testament. He said, well, we have done it so long. You may very well go on. That's not a very good thing. But there is more to it. It is not that the, patriarchy imposed that on the people. It's also the people who do not want to grow up. Because when you say father to somebody, you're a child. You're the lamb, and so it's a good feeling, So you have to be grown up in your profession, but there is a place where you can still be like a child, the father to him, and though you are this child, etc. So that means we have to grow up, and that means concretely we have to think with the Pope, We have to not to let that priest stand up there with all his problems, and we have the little children there, and they don't understand a word what he's doing, and so on. Just 2 priests have left again downtown, and so on. They go on for years and years, and the children are behind him and don't know their suffering or whatever. But if he would participate in their suffering and their thinking, and they could talk to us about it and so on, then maybe we could find a solution to the whole thing. So one has to go into the psychology of the whole thing too. Why people don't want to give up father, to say father, in spite of the fact that by the New Testament they should have long given it up. Okay, do we have any other question? What time is it?
We have about 25 minutes. How much of the movie do
We
you
want to have a movie, right? I promised you a movie. Okay, let me just close up here.
Already have a question over here, though.
Yeah, questions. Oh, yeah. Are there any questions?
Yeah.
Which movie are we looking at, by the way?
This one.
This one?
There was a question? Yes.
Oh, the question is, I guess the future. Our Honorable Scalia is gone,
Yeah.
and it seems like obvious quagmire out there. I'm not sure.
Right.
Where, I guess I'm saying, where do we
does
go?
it go?
Yeah.
Well, first of all, that they tell the President or the Congress that they cannot do this, they cannot replace him now, because it is so close to the end of the presidency and so on. That's unconstitutional. The President has the obligation to put up a candidate now. The Congress has the obligation to look at this fellow and discuss him and so on and so on. So we have to be constitutional. That is one thing on the secular side. That's on the secular side. It has nothing to do with religion whatsoever. Except that a constitution in a democratic state needs a moral basis for it. Otherwise it does not function. People have to do their duties. They have not only rights, they have duties. And for this you need a moral basis. And if the religious moral basis has disappeared, or is disappearing, then you need a secular replacement. And there are beginnings of that. We have a liberal ethics of the state and so on, right? But, I mean, simply formally, by law, the President can bring somebody in now. But who will be brought in? They want to have another Scalia. They want to have another tricky Catholic from Italy, another tricky Italian who will do to the secular people what the secular people do to the religious people, namely use the Constitution in order to preserve old values.
I guess, yes, I was basically pointing to that question.
Yeah, and I think mutual instrumentalization does not help neither. One has to respect, one should not use the Constitution for these purposes. It's not there for these purposes. That is the internal state law of the state, and it should not be instrumentalized as little as religion should not be instrumentalized. So simply to make, like Skinner says here, our psychologist, that religion is a means of social control, you ruin it for the millennials, for the younger generation from the very start. It has been used, of course, all the time, but that is not the very nature in the notion of religion, to control people or to make them better governable or something like that. It's a horrible abuse, yes.
When you're talking about argumentation and authority of the Word of God, revelation, versus authority of what?
Yeah.
And
Well, I mean, on one side, the authority which you have on the secular side are the human rights declarations, right? It's reason. So the Enlightenment stands on human reason. And they were believers in the beginning, so God gave us this reason to use that reason, right? And the Pope here thinks that the so-called natural law and the Sermon on the Mount have the same content. that means that what the Sermon on the Mount says we can also know by reason. It is not so far away. But the Revelation helps us very often to see what we could also see by reason, if our reason would function better.
Is the argumentation seeking to justify ethical decisions and or
Could be,
truth claims as well?
Both of them. So you have two hostile camps. There is no way around to deny this, right? I mean, we see it before our own eyes every day, abortion, premarital, whatever it comes up, right? So what I say is that we do not, on the religious side, lock it up fundamentalistically and say, this is a pagan world, you doctors here, you destroy the last morality which our youth still has. And the others, the doctors say, and there are these bishops, and they think that God puts a soul into the little embryo in the moment of conception, ha, 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 and then they laugh. So they all, these are the two sides now. But this is now laughing matter, so I think they should take each other seriously and enter discourse with each other and not close it up fundamentalistically. You are pagans, and this is Sodom and Gomorrah out there, and, or that is the flood of Noah, and so on the religious side, you have people where everything modern is evil or whatever, and I said before, they get a heart attack, a heart operation anyway. So, but then you have it on the secular side too, where religion is backward and is part of our evolution, and we should get rid of, and so on. Instead of that, I think one should leave it open, not close the discourse up fundamentalistically, nor positivistically, like the university is positivistic, or naturalistically, and so on. And call the other side simply backward and stupid and so on,
Or ignore it completely. I mean, I studied program evaluation. So as soon as you start talking about evaluation, it's impossible to do without going to this level of argument, I think.
Yeah, right.
But nothing in my training prepared me to go to this level of argument.
Yeah,
And
that's right.
the entire revelation side of
Yeah.
the coin is ignored until you go out to practice,
Right, yeah.
where it rules people's lives. And it's the argument to which they use to justify participating, funding, all kinds of things.
Yeah.
And so the conversation, who facilitates it?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I take my students to the hospital, and we have the psychologists who are all secular, and they say, we like the atheists best, because when the dying comes, the atheists have no problem. It's all the religious people who have all the problems. Yeah. But then they come up and say, these enlightened doctors say, well, didn't Freud say, opium of the people? No, it was not Freud, it was Marx. No, it was not Marx, it was Hegel. No, it was Kant. No, they don't even know their own enlightenment situation. They don't even know who they are. So therefore, we have the problem that we have, like Trump, religious people who don't even know what religion means. But then we have people on the enlightenment side who have lost contact to the great enlightenment tradition which produced our Constitution. It didn't fall from heaven; it came from France. From the encyclopedists. So it's a tremendous accomplishment, right? So, and we need maybe a renewal of both of them, of religion and as well of the Enlightenment. But it has to be rescued, both of them. Otherwise you have barbarism. Just think of the vulgarity which breaks through already in civil discourse, now to the election and so on. So we are always just one step away from barbarism.
It's interesting how the fanaticism on both the religious and secular end
Yeah.
is fueled by a willful ignorance on both sides. Both the religious and all of the many religions, whether Muslim, Christian, whatever, it's all fueled by a willful ignorance. And same with like the Richard Dawkins and the Christopher Hitchens, it's a willful ignorance of mystery.
Right.
And,
So maybe, that
And
one...
if that was individual, that would be one thing, but it's institutional.
Right.
it is.
Yeah.
It is very much
collective,
so.
yeah. So therefore the discourse, now you could say, well, discourse with ISIS or whatever, discourse doesn't work. You cannot talk with these people and so on. Well, you always have to think when you say discourse, that's just words, The alternative is always war, already in marriage, If she says, honey, we have to talk about it, and he looks at the football game and drinks the beer, then he's divorced already. They are divorced already. So that is the alternative, which would say, you know, okay, before we go to the last thing and kill each other off, maybe we should talk with each other, and that means to take the other, no matter how he is. You know, I don't like the fascists at all, and I never did, and I don't like ISIS and so on, but they are not chimpanzees or whatever. They are human beings, and therefore one should listen to their argumentation. Why not listen to the grievances of these people? What are their grievances, you know? But when you say we have to annihilate them, you know, that's already a fascist statement, you know. So, but what are their grievances? Are they about colonialism? Did we do something to the Caliphate of Damascus or Baghdad or whatever? Do they think we should go home? Probably they would think we should go home. Now we should consider this, you know, if we should not go home. But maybe we don't want to go home. Maybe we have to defend ourselves in Baghdad or whatever. But then at least, you know, the grievances are on the table instead of being repressed. And we may go there to Iran, there maybe in December, if I can make it travel-wise and so on, and we will go to Moscow and so on. One has to go to the other side, and then if you think that is weak and just babbling and so on, then just think what the alternative is. The Russians, we have 77,000 atomic bombs together. What do you think when one suddenly falls on Kiev or on Baltimore? So therefore, we are superior to the chimpanzees that we can talk. And no matter how powerless we are, we can still talk. When you meet somebody on the street, you can still say, I like Trump, or I don't like Trump, and so on. That little power we still have, right? And when many people make use of that, it can have mass effects. So that it means then, you know, when somebody says I'm against abortion or against, where does that come from, you know? Or I'm for celibacy, where do you get that from, you know? And where are there contradictions in your argument, you know? And if he is a reasonable man, I mean, dogs have no religion. Only somebody who has reason can have religion.
Often people don't know
Yeah.
where their own arguments come
On
from.
both sides,
Yeah.
that's true. So, okay, so there is an educational problem there, and the question
And
is
here
what
you
we
all are, becoming educated.
Yeah. Right.
You're the solution.
Scary.
But we are not doing a good
I mean, I've
job.
been in many situations where that question is perceived as an attack.
Yeah.
It's a,
Yeah.
Yeah.
But see, there is something, when I say something to an American friend or so, I say, I have cancer. Oh, I have cancer too, I had it 3 times and so on. There is this competitive stuff, you know. I went to Jerusalem. I go there for vacations every year. So and it comes, you know, it comes automatically, you know. But there is a mechanism there. Maybe one should work on that mechanism and say, I went to Jerusalem. Fine, and what did you do in Jerusalem? I don't have to tell them that I was in Jerusalem too, but just non-competitively. So, okay, is that possible? And it has something to do with solidarity. It's our weak point, solidarity, you know, because we emphasize rightly personal autonomy and so on and so. But if you have no solidarity, you know, then it means me, and all the time, you know, it becomes narcissistic. This Narcissus who looks into the lake and sees only his face all the time, you know, and finally falls in the water and gets drowned, of course. So it's right, you know. But then you have this other opposite type, you know. He can go out to other people, but then cannot come home. Don Juan, you know, has 500 girlfriends in Spain and 600 in Italy or whatever. And none of these women allowed this creep to come home to himself and become a free person. And so Mozart puts him into hell. And that's where he belongs. He belongs into hell. So these are the 2 types, you see. And what freedom really means is absence of alienation. It means that you can go to the other side, to these Arabs. Or the 2 Arabs come to me last week, and they want me to make a video. You know what? They bought me a tie. They bought me a tie. Do you know what that means? A tie is the symbol of the French Revolution. That's when the people started to have ties. Now there come these guys out of the desert there with Mohammed, you know, and buy me a tie, you know. So, well, we had a wonderful discussion, and we made a wonderful video or so. But,
And he wore the tie.
well, I still have it, I keep it forever. Wonderful, so.